All right, thank you so much for that lovely introduction, and also to my co-organizers for inviting me to speak. Let me see if I've learned this mapping. Okay, great. So I work on neural interfaces, which I like to think of as sort of changing how our nervous system interacts with the external world. We can use technologies like neural recording to take information from the brain to control things in the environment. And we can also use neural stimulation to write information into the nervous system. And these exciting tools open up really new opportunities for therapies. So for instance, if someone's paralyzed due to a spinal cord injury, you could record the activity from the motor cortex and use that to control an external device. So there's lots of different kinds of neural interfaces. That example is a motor brain-computer interface. It's the main thing that I work on and what I'm going to focus on today. And of course, this is not a new idea, and there have been some really exciting proof of concept clinical trials proving that this is potentially an option to restore function to a wide variety of different people. So computationally, brain-computer interfaces have always been thought of really as kind of a machine learning problem. If I could figure out just the right kind of algorithm to extract information from neural recordings, to get the right command to send to a robotic limb so that it moves in the right direction, problem solved, right? But actually, this is just a small piece of what happens when someone uses a brain-computer interface. Because that command goes to the robot moves, and the user has immediate feedback about that movement. They can use that to update their strategies over time. So the brain is actually in a closed loop dialogue with the device, and decades of research have really pointed out that this actually changes the nature of the problem. In particular, because this feedback allows the brain to do what it does best, which is learn, and there's plasticity that happens in brain-computer interfaces. And so this opens up new computational challenges, but it also opens opportunities, which motivate a lot of the work that I do. Could we think about plasticity as a tool in our engineering toolkit to actually improve performance of these devices? And can we actually expand the kinds of things that we can do with brain-computer interface technologies towards not just restoring function, but also thinking about rehabilitation? And so I was not quite as diligent as our prior speaker in actually following the assignments, but in the talk, I want to sort of highlight in particular some of the potential challenges that arise towards achieving those goals. And so one in particular is that we actually have two possible learners in a brain-computer interface. We have the brain that can learn via plasticity, but we actually also have computational tools and machine learning so that we can have algorithms that actually adapt to our users as well. And this has been incredibly powerful as a technology for thinking about customizing BCIs to particular users. But now we have two potential learners, which makes the system much more complex. And so today I want to dig into a few examples of this kind of complexity and focus on two questions. The first is, do these machine learning algorithms actually care about whether plasticity is happening in the brain? Is it important or not? And then the next is, what kinds of computational tools might we need beyond the existing machine learning approaches when we have this co-adaptive system? So in the first part of my talk, I want to focus on this question of, do the algorithms actually need to consider the plasticity in the brain? And this is work done by my graduate student, Pavi Rajeswaran, in close collaboration with Guillaume Lajoie's lab at Mila, and in particular, a postdoc in his group, Alexander Payer. So here, what we're doing is analyzing data from a preclinical animal model of brain-computer interfaces. So a monkey had an implant so we could record activity in the motor cortex of his brain. We measured the firing rates of those neurons and mapped them to control the velocity of a computer cursor moving around on the screen. The monkey is then trying to have that cursor move from point A to point B so that he gets a trial right and gets a drop of juice. And that mapping of how the neural activity controls the velocity is actually being potentially updated over time using machine learning. And we did that for two reasons. The first is to sort of calibrate the device to that particular animal. And then the other is dealing with the practical realities that it's difficult to measure the same neural activity for long periods of time. So whenever our measurements might drift, we could adapt and update the decoder. So I did those experiments actually for this data set in my PhD with Jose Carmena. And one thing we were really excited to see is that the machine learning could actually help us get stable performance of the device, even when we had these drifting measurements. But in addition, we also saw that the users were also learning as well. So if you look at this performance curve that I'm showing you, you might recognize it as sort of having very typical characteristics of a natural sensory motor learning curve. And if we looked at the neural activity, we also saw evidence of changes. And so what Pavi was interested in my lab is digging in a little bit more into what is actually changing in the underlying neural encoding. And so to do that, she did an offline decoding analysis. So we're going to have neural activity that we use to train a classifier to then say, how well can we predict the target that the animal was trying to reach to? We're going to take advantage of the fact that this is an offline analysis, and we can actually look at not just how the neurons that are directly controlling the cursor contribute to movement, we call those readout neurons, but we're also actually measuring larger neural populations that also are contributing, that are in motor cortex, but aren't directly controlling the cursor. We call those non-readout neurons. And so this analysis now lets us look at kind of which neurons are encoding movement, how that information is distributed across this population, and how it might change over time. And so one of the first things that Pavi did was look at what are just the guts of the classifier, what are the weights? And so this is visualized here as a heat map. The neurons are on the y-axis, the time bins that we're using are on the x. And so when you see sort of more saturated colors, that means that that neuron at that particular time is contributing to the decoder. So this is our classifier on day 2. If we now look at how this might be changing over time, we saw some really interesting effects. So the first one is obviously that the encoding is changing over time, suggesting that the user is learning. But we also noticed a couple of interesting things. The first is that these readout neurons that are controlling the cursor are the most predictive. That's somewhat unsurprising. They are directly controlling the cursor after all. But what you might notice is that those non-readout neurons are initially somewhat active and they gradually become less and less active. And in addition, even within that readout population, it actually looks like late in learning, sort of on day 17, there's really just a few neurons that are really contributing to this decoding. And this was sort of surprising to us, so we wanted to quantify it a little bit more closely. So we did an analysis where we looked at if we add neurons from most predictive to least predictive, how many do we need to get to good decoding performance? And so early in learning is in the blue, late in learning is in purple. And for 2 animals across all different learning that they did, we always saw that this number kept decreasing. And this was really fascinating to us. So one possibility is actually that what's happening is just the ensemble is more efficient. And maybe if we grabbed any 10 neurons, we would get to good performance. So to try to dig in a little bit more to how things were distributed in the population, we did an analysis that takes a little bit to wrap your head around, so let me unpack this plot for you. What we did was vary this number of neurons that we're using to decode, that's on the x-axis, and then for every possible combination, we asked of 1 neuron versus 2 neurons, et cetera, how well can we predict? And so for all possible combinations is shown in black. If we now think about, let's grab our most helpful predictive neurons, the 5 best ones, if that's shown in green. And what we find is that when we have those 5 neurons, we're always golden. We can basically always get to really high performance of about 90% or so. Let's now think the opposite way. And what if we don't have those 5 neurons? In that case, we are really out of luck. And the best we can do is about 50%. And so what this really points to is the fact that after learning, there's this kind of key population that is actually doing the encoding of movement, and that's fundamental. So why this is happening is a huge, interesting question. But when I put my engineering hat on, I also get really concerned because this potentially makes brain-computer interfaces really fragile. If I lose one of those 5 neurons, I could have catastrophic failure of my device. And so we then wanted to ask, is this happening because of that adaptive decoder? And so this is really difficult to get at experimentally, but this is where our collaboration with the Lajoie group came in handy. So what they did was actually develop an artificial neural network model of brain-computer interfaces. So they have a recurrent neural network, they train it to control a limb, and then we can actually do BCI experiments in this in silico model. And they've used this model to actually recapitulate a lot of important experimental observations that have been reported in BCI literature. So we're excited to have this sort of test bed. So then what we did was we trained this model either with adaptive decoders or fixed decoders, and we did the same kind of analysis that we did on the experimental data. And so this is again that plot where we have sort of the predictive accuracy as a function of the size of the population. And the key thing I want you to notice is that the distribution is very different when you have an adaptive decoder versus a fixed decoder. And so what this suggests to us is that what is learned by the neural activity, the sort of structure of the encoding, is very directly influenced by the decoder. And so to sort of wrap up these two, this portion of the talk, we find that plasticity can really fundamentally change how information is structured or encoded in the brain. And this is potentially a big concern when we think about how well we can actually decode it for these kinds of devices. And that this neural representation is very fundamentally influenced by the decoding algorithm. I also want to really quickly point out that I find this particularly interesting because all of the interventions we're doing with our adaptive decoder are actually helping. We are always improving performance when we adapt the decoder, and yet the neural ensemble representations are still changing. You would normally expect the brain to change in response to errors, but this is actually not what's happening. And so I think this really points out the importance of decoders considering plasticity mechanisms that are happening in the brain. Because these decoders may make changes that have short-term benefits to performance, but they could actually have long-term potential consequences by changing the way that information is encoded in the brain, for instance, with this issue of robustness of the device. But then also it opens up exciting opportunities to think about actually using the decoder, right, to shape the plasticity and the representations in the brain. And so in the second part of my talk, I want to kind of move towards what kinds of computational frameworks might we need to get to that goal. And this is work led by a grad student in my lab, Manishka Maduri, in close collaboration with Sam Burden at UW. So first, I want to talk about why we actually need new frameworks at all. So existing brain-computer interface work is largely uses machine learning methods. And there, the goal of the decoder is always to match the current encoder of the brain. But this doesn't allow us to really consider the dynamics, right? When we update that decoder, the encoder might change. And so by not having a way to think about those interactions, we ultimately don't have a way to think about sort of this goal of shaping or guiding learning in the system. And so our proposal is to sort of address this by thinking about the problem a slightly different way. Brain-computer interfaces are not just a machine learning problem, they're actually a game, right? The agent of the user or the brain is actually playing a game with the algorithm, and they are collaborating together to do the task. And so we can then think about these two agents that make choices about how they're going to change or move based on cost functions. If we could write down some sort of form of cost functions for the user and for the algorithm, then we can actually use tools of game theory to really directly model the dynamics. And so I think actually thinking about brain-computer interfaces as a game actually sort of also points to existing further limitations of existing approaches. So when you think about a game, one of the important things to consider is the timing of when each user is making movements, right? So for instance, one player might make a choice and then the next player has to follow and react. But this is just a small, and so current approaches largely are thinking about that, where the decoder may change and then the encoder changes in response. But that's actually just a kind of tiny limited range of dynamics. So I've sort of visualized that idea here where you have sort of the actions that you can take in this space kind of all follow along the X or Y axis, right? But if we think about kind of needing to potentially shape plasticity, we might need richer dynamics and sort of ways to think about richer dynamics where maybe agents are making decisions at the same time, and game theory turns that simultaneous play. And so I think really this game theory framing kind of helps us think about getting towards some of these goals as opposed to sort of restricting the ways in which users might interact with the device. And so I now kind of want to quickly touch on how we've been trying to take this idea of game theory and bring it into brain-computer interfaces. And so one of the first steps that Manishka took was to actually just write out some models. Let's think about the math of this system. And so we made a very simple, admittedly, system, but where we wrote down cost functions for the user and the decoder. And so we decided to say that the user obviously cares about minimizing the error of the task, but they may also want to minimize their effort. It doesn't make sense to generate incredible amounts of neural activity to control the cursor. We then also said that the decoder also cares about minimizing task error. And in traditional machine learning approaches, that would be the only thing the decoder cared about. But we could also say that maybe the decoder doesn't want to bend over backwards to meet the user. It also cares about its effort. And so in this game, we can actually now write down something called a potential function that lets us describe the full dynamics of this system and how it's going to evolve. And so what this lets us do is actually analytically understand what the system is going to do. If you have simple systems, you can actually fully solve the equations, and that's what's visualized here. In practice, these systems are very high dimensional and hard to analytically solve, but you can do, we've done some work to show that you can do stochastic simulations as well to get the same basic principles in a model. And so this plot here shows you an example of kind of how two agents are going to move in the system. So the way to interpret this plot is if my encoder, for instance, starts at +2 and my decoder starts at -2, I'm going to move along those arrows and I'm going to end up at that sort of bottom. Do I have a pointer actually? I do, but okay, the people on Zoom won't be able to see it. So you're going to end up on that sort of bottom equilibrium point. And so when we started writing out these equations and visualizing things like this, we noticed a few really interesting things. One is that these systems always have multiple possible equilibria. So you could have lots of different possible solutions. And that where those equilibria are, how many there are, et cetera, depend on things like the cost function terms, but also the initial decoder that you give and the learning rates in the system. The other thing that falls out of this is actually that equilibria sometimes don't exist. You can actually create unstable systems, right? And we found our model kind of made some nice predictions that are consistent with both prior experimental intuitions as well as one other existing model of co-adaptive brain-computer interfaces. And so I don't really have a lot of time to dig into it, but I want to quickly point out that now with those sort of this theoretical grounding, what we're hoping to do is actually test these with new experiments. And so we're doing a myoelectric interface approach which allows us to actually test in a lot of different subjects how, as they learn to control this mapping of muscle activity to cursor movements, a lot like the tasks that the monkeys were doing in a brain-computer interface, how does the adaptive algorithm interact with their approaches and their learning, and can we nudge them into different equilibria? So that is sort of the motivating question of a lot of these experiments is, can we actually get people to learn different encoders just simply by manipulating the decoder? And so to wrap up, I want to sort of highlight that neural interfaces really give us an opportunity to think about actively shaping plasticity in the nervous system, which I think is an exciting tool for rehabilitation applications. But doing so is really going to require these new computational frameworks where we have to think about multi-agent learning systems. And so I proposed here this idea of game theory as a way to do that, but I'm really looking forward to talking more with the experts in this room about other things that might be important in this. And then the last thing, kind of speaking towards challenges and where I'm particularly excited to talk to people here, is that, the elephant in the room is this brain cost function, right? This approach really requires having some way of writing down what this cost function is. And so that's going to require fundamental insights into the way that the brain is learning. And then also even thinking more broadly and about the other topics that we're going to hear about in this workshop, how can we measure aspects of user behavior that may give us insights into their cost function? And how could we personalize these cost functions? Because it's not going to be uniform. Everyone's going to have a slightly different cost function. And so with that, I want to conclude. Thank you for your attention. And of course, thank you to all the folks that have done the work. And here's some pointers where you can find me on the web. Like Helen mentioned, I'm in the middle of Women's History Month tweeting things. So definitely encourage you to check that out. Thanks.
Really love this approach. I think it's great. There's a beautiful mind and Nash solutions joke in here somewhere.
Yep.
My question for you is, how do you define like a cooperative versus collaborative goal such that, one of the agents doesn't become lazy?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think right now we are, the way that we've thought about these games is as very inherently collaborative because there is a shared goal, right? If you look at those cost functions, both of the agents care about minimizing task error. I do think that, when you think towards, for instance, personalization, some users may be more or less collaborative with the algorithm. We've noticed actually one of the things that I, coming from, animal model research, one of the things I've really enjoyed about doing the human clinical trials is just getting to see the huge breadth of kind of variability in how people interact with these systems. And so I think it's going to be a really important question. I don't think we have a good handle on it yet, but I think it's a spot on observation.
Amy, that was really nice talk.
Thank you.
And I love the approach of sort of looking at the cost functions. And I know that at the last slide, you had mentioned the focus of looking at different cost functions. And might you sort of maybe speculate a little bit about, I noticed that your cost function sort of was a signed cost function. And so how does the changing of that cost function, like I would imagine you might have thought about sort of a non-signed error and how that might shape the dynamics. Because I think the sensitivity to the dynamics is really interesting.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm trying to think if I have kind of a short answer for it. I think the biggest things that we've explored right now are less different types of cost functions. So I think it's a great question of what is the right error metric is a huge one, especially in the context when I think about, part of the reason I like these really simple cursor control systems is because error is a little bit easier to quantify. But if you start thinking about, real rehabilitation with people trying to make movements, what is error in that space is a really rich question. So we've done a little bit less of that, but I think the biggest thing that we've focused on in particular is the learning rates. So what is very clear is that the learning rate of the algorithm, it's not just that there's sort of a magic learning rate, it actually needs to be very carefully titrated to the learning rate of the user. And so we found even, and this has been recapitulated in the experiments, is that, many users, when they first encounter this system, kind of don't really know what it's doing and they're learning relatively slowly. And so if we have decoders that are adapting very quickly, it actually completely disrupts the system and they kind of can't learn what's going on. So that's where we've currently focused, but I think you're absolutely right to point out the richer aspects of the cost function.
Very nice talk. So regarding the first part of the talk, these the top 5, best cells or whatever, are they always, if you change the way the algorithm is performing or doing the calculations, are these, usually always the best, or they depend on how you do the algorithm is basically doing the calculations?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll say a few things. One is that experimentally, it's very difficult to directly answer your question, but the best neurons, so to speak, the sort of ones that end up being most useful, They're not always necessarily directly related to sort of underlying neurophysiological aspects that you would think might be important. So how predictive those neurons are of natural movements, for instance, doesn't differ from the ones that ultimately decide not to participate in the BCI task. There's a lot of nuances, and it's actually very hard to predict which ones will win. My intuition for what might be happening that I'm very interested to drill into further is what I think is happening is sort of what you're alluding to, is this interaction with the algorithm. So I think what happens is intuitively is that early on, the animal has 20 neurons that are controlling the cursor. It figures out a few of them that might be important. And then the algorithm updates and it gives those neurons that have upregulated higher weights, and the ones that haven't figured out that they're participating in the task at lower weights. And if you repeat that process kind of ad nauseum, you end up with this winner take all phenomenon. And so I think there's a lot of really interesting questions that we're starting to think about designing experiments to get into what is that mechanism, right? And what is the interaction that we need to potentially constrain. Yeah.
So does this mean that if the electrode breaks, for example, and then you lose one of these, top cells, then the algorithm on its own will update and then get a new top performer to, improve the performance?
Yeah, I think potentially that's possible. I think why I'm so concerned about this sort of consolidation that we see is that I think that relearning process may take a long time, right? And so you don't ideally want an interface that, oh, we lost one of your best neurons, so now you have to do another week of relearning how to control this device, right? That would be incredibly frustrating. So, yeah.
Very nice talk. Have you thought about, once you really get a good handle on this and the learning dynamics, right? Like that's kind of a description of how the system will evolve, but we really want and rehab like normative statements of like how we will get it to a certain point, which almost introduces like a sort of meta game theory layer, right? Where you want to say, I want to tune this thing or set up a sequence of training to get it to places. So have you thought about that at all?
That is a very good question. And I think it's definitely important to think about. I think I don't have super concrete answers for you yet, but what I do think is particularly nice about sort of this game theory framing is that particularly slightly more than machine learning, at least in my understanding of the fields, there's a lot more ability to sort of write down safety guarantees and, sort of stability of the systems is much easier to think about kind of quantifying towards that goal, right? Of actually making kind of concrete predictions about, for this particular person, we expect that this should work and so on. But yeah, but I don't think we have a good handle on exactly how to do that yet.
One closing question here in the front.
Yeah, thanks. Great, very provocative and interesting. It makes me think, it makes me put on my physical therapist hat and think about, we have a concept in neurorehabilitation of sort of compensation versus plasticity or recovery. And I think what we've learned is that in teaching patients and training patients, training them on a very simple task over and over inevitably leads them into places where they then can't do other tasks. So I wonder if the problem really here is that the task is not very rich, not very robust. And if you actually train them to do an entirely different task, like trace a circle or something like that, you would now not run into that problem of a very restricted set of neurons.
Yeah, I think that's a spot on observation, and I completely agree. I think, when I think about what the brain might be doing, if you're controlling a two-dimensional cursor, you need two neurons, right? It might be trying to find the most efficient possible solution. I think so we definitely do have, I guess I'll make two quick observations. One is that, we do typically do these very simple tasks in the 2D realm. we found that performance always generalizes to more complex tasks. So we can, for instance, do obstacle avoidance and have them trace mazes. I've actually also done some work where we do real stress tests of the system to control actually your arm plus a BCI cursor at the same time, things like that. So I'm not entirely sure that it's just about the limited set, but I think it's absolutely a really interesting point to think about, in the broader space, not just what the algorithm can potentially do to shape learning, but also thinking about sort of the curriculum, right? So machine learning is very interested in these ideas of curriculum learning. And I think there'll be a lot of really interesting directions in that space here as well.